Staying awake all night and sleeping during the day isn't for everyone, but for me it's always been second nature. As a kid, I could never sleep at night and usually ended up catching naps during school. I can't even count the number of times my teachers woke me up mid-class, their voices sharp and annoyed while my classmates stifled laughter. When I turned 16, I had to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. I wasn't like everyone else. My nights were my active hours, and I wanted a career that matched my rhythm. That's when I started considering night shifts, specifically becoming a security guard. I had the right look for it. I'm tall, muscular, and spend a lot of time at the gym, which makes me appear pretty intimidating. Although if I'm honest, my tough appearance doesn't quite match my personality. But hey, appearances are half the battle, right? After a few years in the job, I'd seen my fair share of unusual shifts, but nothing like the opportunity that recently landed in my lap. My boss, Dave, approached me out of the blue with an offer. "You interested in a hospital gig?" "Just 3 nights, he said, leaning on my desk. "Pays triple what you usually make." "Triple?" I asked, my interest immediately piqued. "Yeah, but it's a little different. I need someone reliable and experienced, someone I can trust." I wasn't about to let this chance pass me by. Triple pay for 3 nights? That kind of money could cover a lot of bills. Besides, the challenge intrigued me. I figured if I pulled it off, it might lead to better assignments down the line. "I'm in," I said, shaking his hand. Relief washed over his face as though he'd struggled to find anyone else willing to take the job. That should have been my first red flag, but I ignored it. "You start Thursday. Be there by 10 p.m. sharp," he said firmly. "You got it." The week passed uneventfully. I worked my usual shifts at places like a local college and a 24-hour diner. Nothing exciting ever really happened, which made me even more eager for the hospital job. When Thursday finally came, I decided to leave early. The hospital was about a 30-minute drive, but I wanted to get there with plenty of time to spare, partly to avoid any surprises and partly to familiarize myself with the place. I didn't want to mess this up. The drive was busier than I expected for that hour, and I pulled into the hospital parking lot around 8:40 p.m. From the outside, the building looked old, like it belonged in some small, forgotten town. Its red brick walls and arched windows gave it an eerie, vintage feel. The structure wasn't massive, just 3 stories tall with narrow hallways visible through the windows. As I stepped out of my car, a strange chill ran down my spine. Shaking it off, I made my way to the entrance. Inside, the hospital had a surprisingly cozy vibe. The front desk was manned by a woman who looked to be in her late 50s. Her warm smile instantly put me at ease. "Hi there. I'm here for the night shift security position," I said confidently, trying to match her energy. "I know I'm a bit early. I'm supposed to start at 10 p.m. She tilted her head slightly, her smile unwavering. "Your name, hun?" "Jason," I replied. She typed something into the computer in front of her, her eyes scanning the screen. I felt a little awkward standing there, but I kept my posture professional. "Your supervisor's Dave, right?" she asked, glancing back at me. "Yes, ma'am," I replied. She nodded, her fingers tapping a few more keys before looking up. "All right, you're all set. You can wait in the lobby or explore the ground floor until your shift begins. I'll let Dr. Walsh know you're here." "Thank you," I said, flashing a polite smile. As she turned back to her screen, I took a seat in the corner of the lobby. The room was eerily quiet despite its warm lighting. A few patients wandered the hallways, some accompanied by nurses. Everything seemed normal. But something about the atmosphere felt off, like an unspoken tension hung in the air. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just nerves. After all, it was just another job. Right? "All right," the at the front desk said with a smile, "One of the other security guards will be here shortly to go over the procedures with you. Would you like some coffee while you wait?" "That'd be great," I replied, my voice grateful but steady. "Black, please." She chuckled softly before walking off to get the coffee. A few minutes later, she returned with a steaming cup. I took a sip and immediately noticed how rich and smooth it was, better than anything I'd ever tasted. Just as I finished the last drop, I spotted a tall man approaching me. He had broad shoulders and a no-nonsense expression, his presence commanding the room. He looked me over, eyes scrutinizing every inch of me before speaking. "So, you're the guy they sent? Didn't expect someone so young, but that doesn't matter as long as you can follow instructions." I stood and extended a hand toward him. "Nice to meet you, sir. I'm Jason. I take it you're here to show me the ropes?" He glanced at my hand for a moment, then shook it firmly. His grip was strong, almost crushing, but I held my ground, meeting his gaze. My dad always told me to look confident even when you're not. People respect confidence. "Follow me," he said curtly, motioning for me to come along. I followed him down a dimly lit hallway, the faint hum of fluorescent lights echoing above us. The man led me to the security room, a small space packed with monitors displaying the hospital's security cameras. He began explaining how the system worked and walked me through the basics, most of which I'd heard a dozen times before in previous jobs. "All right," he said, standing by the door as we finished the tour. "One last thing before I leave. You see that paper on the desk?" I nodded, spotting a single sheet of paper placed neatly on the desk. "Read it. Those are the rules you need to follow during your shift. No exceptions. And listen, kid, take them seriously. They might sound unusual, but breaking any of those rules could cost you more than just your job." His voice was stern, almost warning, and it sent a chill down my spine. "I understand," I said, keeping my tone firm, though my stomach churned with unease. "Good. Follow them, no matter how bizarre they seem. Good luck." And with that, he left. The door creaked shut behind him, leaving me alone in the security room. I glanced at the clock above the door. 9:30 p.m. 30 minutes until my shift officially started. My eyes shifted to the paper on the desk. I picked it up and scanned the list of rules, my brows furrowing with every word. Rule 1. Your shift begins at 10 p.m. Ensure you are inside the security room by that time. Between 10:15 p.m. and 11 p.m., patrol the building to confirm that no unauthorized individuals are present. If you encounter anyone, politely ask them to leave. Rule 2. Between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m., you may hear a knock on the front door. It will be a young woman asking to see her husband. Do not respond, and do not acknowledge her. She will leave eventually. Rule 3. Keep the lights in the intensive care unit ICU on at all times. If the lights turn off, go to the ICU immediately and turn them back on. If you hear screaming while the lights are off, hide in the nearest bathroom until the screaming stops. Only then should you turn the lights back on. Rule 4. If you see a little girl in the cafeteria holding a teddy bear, sit next to her. Do not speak unless she speaks to you first. If she looks at you, leave immediately and return to the security room. Rule 5. At 1 a.m., check the general ward. If a patient is sitting up in bed, ask if they're all right and do whatever they request. If they initiate unrelated conversation, ignore it. Rule 6. If it starts raining, open the front doors and let people in for shelter. Ensure everyone you let in leaves before the rain stops. If someone doesn't leave, you will see them on the security cameras. Do not look directly at them. Rule 7. If the security cameras go offline at any point during your shift, hide immediately. Do not come out until the cameras are back online. I set the paper down, leaning back in my chair with a nervous laugh. This has to be some kind of joke, I muttered to myself. But deep down, I didn't believe that. Something about the man's warning and the eerie quiet of the hospital told me otherwise. This is just a test, I thought. A way to see how well I follow orders. I read over the rules again, making sure I had them memorized. Whatever this was, I wasn't going to mess it up. The clock struck 10 p.m., and I turned my attention to the security monitors. Nothing unusual showed up on the screens. Everything seemed normal. I spent the next 15 minutes scrolling through my phone to pass the time, but before I knew it, it was 10:15 p.m. Time to patrol. Stretching my legs, I made my way to the elevator. I decided to start on the 3rd floor and work my way down. The elevator dinged softly as the doors opened, revealing an empty hallway. As I stepped out, the quietness of the floor felt unnerving. Just a normal shift, I whispered to myself, trying to shake the growing tension. Or so I hoped. I headed up to the top floor, flashlight in hand, and began my rounds, checking every room, corridor, and even the restrooms. As expected, everything was quiet. Too quiet, actually. Most night shifts as a security guard were uneventful, just being present in case of an emergency. This hospital seemed no different so far, making it feel like an easy paycheck. Plus, I could grab coffee and snacks whenever I wanted, so I wasn't complaining. After clearing the 3rd floor without incident, I descended to the 2nd. Like the floor above, the entire area was completely vacant. No patients, no staff. That alone felt odd. Hospitals are never entirely empty. I expected at least a few doctors on call or maybe some janitorial staff, but there was nothing. I shook off the unease and checked my phone. It was 10:32 p.m. Plenty of time to complete the 1st floor before the hour was up. The 1st floor included the intensive care unit, the cafeteria, and the security room. I decided to sweep through the ICU and main hall first, saving the cafeteria for last so I could grab a quick snack before heading back. As I entered the ICU, my flashlight illuminated a figure standing in one of the rooms, a man, easily in his 70s, staring blankly out the window. For a moment I froze, my heart racing. Then I remembered Rule 1. If you encounter anyone, kindly ask them to leave. I sighed in relief, assuming this must be part of the test my boss had orchestrated. Maybe he'd hired an actor to see if I'd follow the rules. I approached the man confidently. "Excuse me, sir," I said firmly, keeping my voice steady. "You're not supposed to be here at this hour. I'll have to ask you to leave." The man slowly turned to face me, his expression blank, almost vacant. He said nothing, just stared at me. "Sir, please," I repeated. "You'll need to leave." Finally, he gave a small nod and shuffled past me toward the exit. I followed him to the front door and watched as he disappeared into the darkness. "Good night, sir," I called after him. Just before he vanished from sight, he turned back and said something that sent chills down my spine. "Be careful of the surgeon." I stood there for a moment, frozen. What surgeon? Was this part of the test too? Shaking it off, I convinced myself it was just another attempt to mess with me and resumed my patrol. The rest of the 1st floor was uneventful. I grabbed a cup of coffee and a croissant from the cafeteria and made my way back to the security room. The clock read 10:53 p.m., leaving me just enough time to relax before the next task. Back in the security room, I leaned back in my chair, sipping coffee and scrolling through my phone. Time slipped away, and before I knew it, it was nearly midnight. A quick glance at the security monitors made my stomach drop. The lights in the ICU were off. Rule 3 immediately came to mind. Keep the ICU lights on. If they turn off, turn them back on immediately. If you hear screaming, run to the nearest bathroom and stay there until it stops. I cursed under my breath. I had no idea how long the lights had been off. Grabbing my flashlight, I headed for the ICU. Halfway there, the sound of blood-curdling screams erupted from the hallway ahead. The noise was so loud, so raw, it stopped me dead in my tracks. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. This couldn't be part of a test. The agony in those screams was too real. Suddenly, I heard a door creak open behind me, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps. Panic surged through me. Without hesitation, I bolted to the nearest bathroom, locking myself in one of the stalls. I tried to catch my breath, the screams still echoing in my ears. Whoever was out there wasn't just trying to scare me. This felt real. My thoughts were interrupted when the bathroom door creaked open. Footsteps entered the room, slow and deliberate, just like before. I held my breath, gripping the edges of the stall door. The figure moved from stall to stall, knocking on each one as they passed. "Welcome to the hospital," a voice sang softly. "You can come, but you can't go. Welcome to the hospital." The voice was calm, almost playful, but with an unmistakable undercurrent of malice. My entire body tensed as the knocking reached my stall. The sound was louder, more forceful. "Is anyone there?" The voice called out, cheerful yet deranged. "Come on, don't be shy." I squeezed my eyes shut, praying the figure would leave. Then the voice said something that made my blood run cold. "Come on, Jason. I know you're in there." How did they know my name? My hands were trembling now, but I stayed completely silent. After a few agonizing moments, the figure chuckled softly and began to walk away. "See you soon, Jason," the voice whispered before leaving the bathroom. I stayed locked in the stall for what felt like an eternity, waiting until the screaming stopped. When I finally emerged, the hallway was empty. The lights in the ICU were still off. Fighting the urge to run, I walked to the ICU and flipped the lights back on. I hurried back to the security room, my heart pounding. As I sat in the chair, I checked the rules again. To my relief, I had followed them perfectly so far. Then I saw Rule 5. At 1 a.m., check on the patients. If one is sitting on their bed, ask if they're okay, and do as they request. I swallowed hard. I hadn't seen any patients during my patrols. Who was I supposed to check on? Glancing at the clock, I saw it was almost time. Bracing myself, I grabbed my flashlight and headed to the second floor, opting to take the stairs instead of the elevator. As I stepped onto the floor, a faint coughing sound echoed from one of the rooms. My pulse quickened as I approached the source of the noise. One by one, I started checking the rooms, each step filling me with dread. I cautiously approached the first room, my breath held in anticipation, silently hoping to find nothing but emptiness. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. On the bed lay an elderly woman, her chest rising and falling weakly as she slept. Tubes ran into her nostrils, and an IV needle was embedded in her frail arm. The sight sent a shiver down my spine. I hated seeing people in such conditions. Room after room, the pattern continued. Every patient seemed either gravely ill or severely injured, a reminder of how unsettling hospitals could be at night. The dim lighting only added to the oppressive atmosphere. As I moved further down the hallway, the muffled sound of coughing grew louder, becoming almost unbearable as I neared its source. Of course, it had to come from the last room at the far end of the hall, the one farthest from any escape route. All the other patients were silent, lost in their fitful slumber. Taking a deep breath to steel my nerves, I stood outside the last room's doorway. Slowly, I stepped inside, peering at the man sitting on the bed. He looked frail, his elbow pressed against his mouth as violent coughs racked his body. The moment he noticed me, he tried to speak, his voice strained and raspy. "It don't wait till ya are," he croaked, struggling to get the word out between coughs. For a second, I froze. This man wasn't part of the nightmarish events I'd been experiencing. He seemed like an actual patient. Sympathy flickered in my chest. Whatever this man was going through, it was clearly miserable. Without wasting time, I dashed to the cafeteria, grabbed a cup of water, and hurried back. As I entered the room, he gestured weakly for me to come closer. I handed him the cup, watching as he downed it in a single gulp, like a man who hadn't tasted water in days. He collapsed back onto the bed, his coughing finally subsiding. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice steadier now. "No problem," I replied, trying to sound casual, though my nerves were anything but calm. A minute of silence passed. The man lay back, breathing easier now. Taking that as my cue, I began inching toward the door. I'd done what he asked. There was no reason for me to stay. My hand was just about to touch the doorknob when his voice stopped me cold. "Where are you going?" he asked, his tone suddenly sharp. "Come sit with me, my friend." A chill ran down my spine. Something about his voice now was different, commanding and ominous. Slowly, I turned back toward him, my instincts screaming at me to leave, but the rules were clear. If a patient asks for something, I must comply. With no other choice, I walked back to his bedside and sat down. "Well, what's up?" I stammered, trying and failing to mask my unease. He stared at me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, in a low, grave voice, he began to speak. "I'm not going to hurt you, son. I just want to thank you for helping me. But there's something you need to know." I swallowed hard, nodding for him to continue. "You see, the surgeon..." He paused, his voice trembling slightly. "He stuffed cinnamon down my throat, nearly choking me to death. That's why I couldn't breathe." "What?" I asked, horrified. Then it hit me. The old man I'd escorted out earlier. He'd warned me. "Be careful of the surgeon." "Yes," the patient continued. "That madman is still wandering this building. If you follow the rules, you'll survive. But if you don't..." He let the sentence trail off, leaving the implication hanging in the air. I sat frozen for a moment, his words sinking in. Gathering my courage, I thanked him and stood to leave. Mercifully, he didn't try to stop me this time. As I exited the room, I heard a loud crash echo from the third floor above. My heart jumped, but I forced myself to keep walking. There was no way I was going up there, not after everything I'd seen and heard. If the rules had taught me one thing, it was this: curiosity could get me killed. I quickened my pace back to the security room, every creak of the floorboards behind me sending a spike of anxiety through my chest. Once inside, I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, letting out a shaky breath. For the first time in what felt like hours, I felt a fleeting sense of safety. I glanced at the clock above the door. 1:53 a.m. 4 more hours until my shift ended. 4 more hours until I could walk out of this nightmare. Collapsing into the chair, I reached for the sheet of rules again, scanning each one to make sure I hadn't missed anything. Thankfully, there were no more instructions that required me to leave the room. I muttered a prayer under my breath, hoping the rest of the night would pass without incident. But exhaustion was catching up with me. My eyelids grew heavier with each passing second, and before I knew it, I drifted off in the chair, the terror of the night momentarily forgotten. For now. I woke up abruptly, my eyes darting around the dimly lit security room. It took me a few moments to remember where I was. The clock on the wall read 2:45 a.m. My head throbbed, and my body felt stiff from falling asleep in the chair. For a moment I thought I had dreamed the strange events of the night, but the tension in the air reminded me it was all too real. I decided to grab a coffee from the cafeteria to help me stay awake for the remainder of my shift. As I made my way down the hall, The silence felt heavier than usual, the building's emptiness amplifying every faint creak and whisper. When I entered the cafeteria, it was just as deserted as expected. I headed straight for the coffee machine, watching the dark liquid pour into the cup. The simple act brought a moment of normalcy, a fleeting distraction. As I turned to leave, my heart nearly leapt out of my chest. Sitting at one of the tables was a little girl, her head slightly tilted as she stared at me. She hadn't been there when I walked in. I froze, coffee spilling onto my suit as my hands trembled. My mind raced as I tried to recall the rules. There was something about a little girl in the cafeteria, but the details escaped me. Her presence, though innocent at first glance, sent a wave of unease through me. She turned her head slowly, locking her eyes onto mine. Her curly blonde hair framed a pale face devoid of any emotion. She wore a small white skirt and a pink t-shirt, clutching a worn teddy bear in her hands. One of the bear's button eyes dangled by a thread, swaying slightly as she shifted. The silence was suffocating until she spoke in a soft yet eerie voice. "You forgot the rules," she said, her tone teasing but unnerving. My stomach dropped. The rules. I hadn't followed them properly. I knew it. Her lips curled into a slight smile as she leaned closer. "Want to play hide and seek?" she asked, her voice suddenly bursting with childlike excitement. "I'll count to 60, and then we will look for you." My blood ran cold. I didn't dare ask who we referred to. The only thing I could think to do was run. Leaving the coffee cup behind, I bolted out of the cafeteria, the sound of her laughter trailing after me. 1, 2, 3. Forever with me you'll be. 4, 5, 6. In the darkness, you'll cease to exist, she sang, her voice echoing eerily through the empty halls. I slammed the door to the security room shut and locked it behind me, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. Grabbing the sheet of paper, I frantically searched for the rule about the girl. Rule 4. If there's a little girl with a teddy bear in the cafeteria, sit next to her and don't say a word. If she looks at you, walk back to the security room. If she speaks to you, talk back until she leaves. My heart sank. I had broken the rule. I hadn't talked to her properly. I ran instead. Before I could process what to do next, the security monitors flickered and went dark, leaving me in complete silence. My eyes darted back to the rules. Rule 7. If the security cameras were to turn off any time throughout the night, hide and pray for your life, they won't find you. My breathing quickened as panic took over. Hide? Where? The security room was too obvious. There was nowhere to conceal myself here. I needed to move. I bolted for the front door, desperately trying to open it. I jiggled the handle, threw my weight against it, even kicked it, but it wouldn't budge. The realization hit me like a brick. I was trapped. 52, 53, 54. The girl's voice rang out, her eerie sing-song tone growing louder. 55. Prepare to run for your life. I could hear her footsteps now, echoing down the hall, accompanied by faint giggles. She wasn't alone, and they were coming. Despite feeling like I was on the verge of passing out, my body moved on its own, driven purely by adrenaline. My mind screamed at me to stop and think, but fear had taken control. Without realizing it, I found myself bolting up the stairs to the second floor, heading straight for the room where I had earlier given the patient a cup of water. I flung the door open, only to find the room empty. The man was gone, but I didn't have time to process his disappearance. My priority was survival, and I needed a place to hide. Fast. The little girl's frantic laughter echoed from below, sending chills down my spine. Her haunting voice was now singing again, gleefully announcing that she'd reached 60. I had only moments before she'd start searching the building, and her sing-song tone made it clear she was enjoying the hunt. I scanned the room desperately for a hiding spot, but there was nothing. No closet, no space under the bed. The only option was the ceiling, made up of thin, removable panels. It wasn't ideal, but it was my best chance. Climbing onto the bed to reach the ceiling, I accidentally knocked over a framed photo on the nightstand. The glass shattered as it hit the floor, the sound reverberating through the empty hallways. "I heard that!" she shrieked, her voice echoing with excitement. The sound of her small feet pounding against the floor filled the air as she sprinted toward the room. Panic surged through me. I jumped as high as I could, grabbing onto the edges of the ceiling panel. With all my strength, I pulled myself up, struggling to squeeze into the tight, unstable space. Every movement caused the ceiling to creak and sag under my weight, but I managed to slide the panel back into place just as the door to the room burst open. Through the small cracks in the ceiling, I could see her below. She moved slowly, tiptoeing across the room. "I know you're in here," she said, her voice dripping with anticipation. "I heard you drop something." My heartbeat thundered in my chest, so loud I was terrified she might hear it. I pressed myself against the wooden beams, barely breathing as she searched the room. Her footsteps were light and deliberate, and I could hear the faint rustling of her dress as she moved. Suddenly, there was a soft thud. She was poking the ceiling with a broomstick. The vibration sent shivers through my body. I clenched my teeth, willing myself to stay still. She jabbed at the ceiling a few more times, giggling softly. "I guess you're not here after all," she said, sounding almost disappointed. Her footsteps faded as she left the room, but I knew better than to assume I was safe. The ceiling groaned under my weight, threatening to collapse. I couldn't stay up there much longer. After waiting several agonizing minutes to ensure she was gone, I slowly pushed the panel aside and dropped back into the room, landing as quietly as possible. I peered out into the hallway. It was empty. Carefully, I crept forward, each step measured and silent. The tension in the air was suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards beneath me sent a jolt of terror through my body. I figured the first floor would be safer. She'd already checked there earlier, and I assumed she'd still be upstairs. I moved as quietly as I could, descending the stairs with slow, deliberate steps. As I reached the bottom, I heard the faint sound of her shoes moving on the floor above me. For the first time, I felt a flicker of relief. She was still searching the second floor, but my relief was short-lived. As I rounded the corner, I froze in my tracks. A tall silhouette stood at the far end of the hallway, near the ICU. Even in the dim light, I could make out the faint outline of a man, his figure rigid and menacing. His head turned toward me, and though I couldn't see his eyes, I felt his gaze pierce through me. Panicking, I dove behind the nearest wall, pressing my back against it as I tried to steady my breathing. Then, his voice rang out, low and gravelly, cutting through the silence like a knife. "What is a patient of mine doing out of his room so late?" I realized I had two options, and neither of them felt like they would save me. I could either run back upstairs, risking an encounter with a little girl, or try the bathroom again, hoping it might offer some refuge this time. Both choices seemed like they would inevitably lead to disaster, but I didn't have time to dwell on it. Before I could commit to either option, something caught my eye: a janitor's closet tucked beneath the stairs. It seemed like a better chance than the bathroom, so without hesitation, I darted toward it. Flinging open the door, I squeezed myself behind a container and a pile of trash bags. The space was cramped and smelled awful, but at least it was dark and hidden. "Come on now, I need to inspect your organs," the man's voice boomed, echoing down the hallway. My heart stopped as I heard him open the bathroom door, his voice dripping with mockery. There was something disturbingly familiar about that voice. It sent shivers down my spine, but I couldn't quite place where I'd heard it before. "You were smart enough to hide somewhere else this time," he called out again, now sounding amused. "I'm impressed. You're not as stupid as you look." Then it hit me. It was him, the maniac I had encountered earlier. The realization froze me in place. He knew where I was. He was playing with me, taking his time. I held my breath as I heard his footsteps approach the janitor's closet. The door creaked open. I pressed myself deeper into the pile of trash bags, praying he wouldn't see me. The man lingered for a moment, his presence almost suffocating, before shutting the door again. Too small for a hiding spot, he muttered to himself before walking away. I was left in utter darkness, trembling and terrified. Even though he was gone, I didn't dare move. From somewhere deeper in the hospital, I heard the faint whirring of a drill, followed by the agonized screams of a man. The surgeon's maniacal laughter followed soon after, echoing down the halls. I bit down on my hand to keep from making any noise, trying to drown out the sound of his sick game. I reached for my phone, desperate to know how much time I had left. 5:45 a.m. Only 15 minutes until the hospital staff would arrive for their morning shifts. I just had to survive for a little longer. Exhaustion overtook me, and before I realized it, I had drifted off into an uneasy sleep, still crouched in the corner of the janitor's closet. I was jolted awake by a kind, older man, a janitor. His weathered face showed both surprise and concern as he looked at me, crouched behind his cleaning equipment. "Rough night?" he asked, though my face likely gave him all the answers he needed. "It's over now," he added. "You can come out." His words felt like the sweetest relief I'd ever experienced. I slowly got to my feet, my legs stiff and sore from being cramped for so long. I stepped out into the hallway, blinking as the morning light streamed through the windows. The hospital looked completely different during the day. The eerie, oppressive atmosphere was gone, replaced by the warmth of sunlight and the distant murmur of arriving staff. It felt like a completely different place, almost normal. I thanked the janitor for his kindness and left the hospital as fast as I could. I barely remember the drive home, but the moment I stepped inside my apartment, I collapsed onto my bed. It all felt like some sort of fever dream, too surreal to believe. Yet the terror was still fresh, etched into my mind. I called my boss later that day, telling him I was too sick to work. When his calls came flooding in throughout the week, I ignored every single one. Eventually, I returned to my regular, uneventful shifts. The boredom that had once driven me mad was now a comfort. Because after that night in the hospital, I'd take mind-numbing boredom over terror any day.